The Ghost Management Podcast with Marc-André Gagnon. Assistants Blue Miaorandong, Grace Dubacquet, Eric Mignon. Episode 1 Ghost Management in Medicine with Sergio Sismondo.
Hi, everybody. So, welcome to this first episode of the Ghost Management Podcast. First, I would like to introduce my research assistant, helper, and co-host, Blue. So nice to see you, my friend.
Nice to see you, Mark. Hi, Sergio. Hi, everyone.
I must say, so Blue is research assistant on the research project. She's doing an amazing job, and I asked her to join me a bit to be like to monitor basically this interview, to police me a little bit. So if I get too excited with our special guest for today, basically just okay, Mark, calm down. Let's clarify concepts, elements to make everything as understandable for everybody as possible.
Yes, I have my question ahead, huh?
Yeah, fantastic. So our guest for today is Sergio Sismondo. Sergio, very nice to see you, my friend. Sergio is a professor in Science and Technology Studies at Queen's University. Yeah?
Technically philosophy and sociology, but yes, that's okay.
Yes. So Sergio, for me, has also been an important influence in my life, I must say. So when I was writing my PhD at the time, in fact, he's the one for me who shaped this notion of ghost management. So Sergio was working mostly on looking the way the production of knowledge in medical science was happening and the strategies of corporation in shaping this knowledge. I was working on something completely different about the nature of capital. So the capitalization of power, especially in the pharmaceutical industry, and realizing that with this concept, basically, there's a lot of intersection, and I thought he's the first person I would like to interview for this podcast. So, Sergio, a big welcome. It's a pleasure, honor to welcome you today.
The honor is actually mine. I'm really pleased. Thanks very much for inviting me.
So, Sergio is the author, two books. One textbook in Science and Technology Studies, Introduction to Science and Technology Studies. I must say, when I was doing interviews to get hired as a prof, at one point I applied to a sociology department, and in order to get ready, I read the whole book from A to Z, and I did a fantastic interview, by the way. But I did not finish in this department. I ended up in public policy at Carleton University. But a more recent book that for me is a fantastic one is Ghost Managed Medicine, Big Pharma's Invisible Hands. And this is what I want to discuss with you. Basically, the corporate strategies used in the pharmaceutical sector by big pharma to shape knowledge, shape social structures. But before we do that, the origin of the concept of ghost management, I just wanted to know, I always wanted to ask, how did you come with that idea? So explain to me what you were working on and why you developed this notion of ghost management.
So, in the mid 2000s, like the aughts, as we sometimes say, I got interested in the pharmaceutical industry. I hadn't been working on that before, and I just got interested. And some of the people who it got me interested are people like David Healy, who had written a lot and was an insider critic, as a psychiatrist, insider critic especially of the industry's efforts on psychiatric drugs, but also some people like Jeremy Green, who was working on lots of heart medicines, diabetes medicines, and things like that. So But anyway, a wide variety of people. But one of the things that kept coming up was ghostwriting. And I think Healy, I mentioned Healy especially because he was interested in ghostwriting. And when I started looking at the material, I started seeing something that I thought was kind of odd, that there was a lot of mention of ghostwriting in the medical literature itself. People were paying attention to the possibility of ghost-written articles. There were these articles that were being published in medical journals, and they were ghost-written. But the people in medicine tended to treat this simultaneously as very widespread, but in some sense one-off. That is, they were focused on the individual cases of ghostwriting rather than the phenomenon as a whole. And so I wanted to know things like sort of who hires the writers, who designs the articles, who how much are people paid to do this? So I had a whole bunch of questions, and I'd like to come back to that, but. And so I started thinking about the phenomenon of ghost writing and realized that ghost writing wasn't really the right concept, that it was really too much focused on the writing as opposed to larger phenomena. Here's what I mean. So if you or I were working on a research project and we asked, let's say, Blue to help us out with the writing of an article, and let's say we were unscrupulous and we didn't credit Blue practically at all, and we published the article, that would be unethical, for sure. But would it affect the state of knowledge in the journals? And in a sense, no. I mean, I think that in a sense, as long as Blue just did a good job of taking our work and putting it into good words, then it wouldn't really affect much of anything. So I was thinking, like, it's not actually the ghost writing it's crucial. It's who's paying for that ghost writing, how's it being organized, who's designing it, that sort of thing. And when we're talking about medicine, this matters a lot more than your or my research project or something like that, right? So it matters because there's a larger set of articles that are getting published, and the influence, and we might be concerned about who's influencing that. So moving from ghost writing to the idea, to sort of the ghost management, solved one problem, which is to step away from this focus on individual unethical behavior and to think about sort of larger structures. So that was the main impetus for it. But I might just say, also I don't think that we always need to focus on the writing, because sometimes it's actually other interventions in the knowledge making process that matter more, sort of other ways in which the industry might affect things.
And you're right, as academics, normally we have this academic ethics in terms of, okay, who produced the work. But basically, your point is that we end up with the whole industry of ghostwriting, basically, in order to write things, but write things in order to push it in one specific, in specific directions. So I remember in your work, you focused a lot on this notion of the communication plan, for example, when we're talking about ghost management. Normally, we have this, what is a communication plan?
So usually it's a publication plan, but there's a publication plan would presumably be part of a larger communication plan. I'm not sure how often the communication plan gets used as such, but so a publication plan. So when a pharmaceutical company starts engaging in a bunch of clinical trials, And we can talk about what that looks like. But when they're starting to do a bunch of clinical trials on one of their products or one of their projected products, so something that might not even yet be launched yet, then they start thinking about where's all the data going to get published and who's it going to reach. So they're acquiring a whole bunch of data on this new product, and so then they want to make good use of it. The good use of it is going to be to influence something. And so this is where, I pass the concept of ghost management over to you, because you've developed it in all of these ways and thinking about informational capitalism and things like that. And I think, you and I have passed it back and forth, and we're continuing to develop it. But so the publication plan is it's first and foremost a document. It's a document that says, okay, here's the data that we're going to produce, or that we have produced. Here's how it can be cut up into different pieces and published. And who are the audiences that are going to be reached for this? So you might have a drug where you want to reach both cardiologists and endocrinologists or something like that. You want to publish in journals that both of those, that one or the other of those specialties will respect.
You have the target audiences, but at the same time, what is the type of message we're focusing on in these publication plans?
So typically there would be a central message. The central message would be, this is a drug that you can, and the message is identifying the market, in a sense. The message is saying, this is a drug that you can prescribe with confidence to people over the age of, or under the age of, or something like that. And when you might be otherwise concerned about side effects or something like that. Or the message might be, this is best in its class for some population, some market. So the central message identifies a market. And then you want to target the doctors who might be prescribing for that market. And that's that. These articles are in a sense providing the articles that eventually get published will be providing a kind of support for that market, so that when salespeople go to prescribers' offices, they can say, hey, did you read the latest episode of Annals of Internal Medicine, the latest issue of Annals of Internal Medicine? There's this great article on this drug that I'm here to tell you about.
And this is important, because as soon as we bring in the sales reps that go see physicians armed with different papers, but papers that were designed first and foremost to support the sales pitch of the sales rep, basically what we're seeing is that in the end, the design of the research was organized first and foremost to support the sales pitch, basically. So research is designed as a form of marketing, more or less.
Yeah, it's designed, well, there's the ideal. Let's be honest here. Pharmaceutical companies sort of would love to do it in have some ideal. Of course, they don't always fully control all the aspects of even the things that they are themselves doing. Mm-hmm. So in the ideal, you start the publication plan before you've collected any data, because you might want to design even the research studies around the market, the eventual markets that you want to target. But in practice, the publication plan is often coming up a little bit later, after you've started. There's a kind of there's a kind of back and forth where the data is suggesting something perhaps, and then that this creates a publication plan, which then may shape future studies and so on and so forth, back and forth. But and the people, there's actually a profession, publication planners. There are people who call themselves publication planners, or some version of that, strategic publication planners or something. And ideally, they would want to be involved in the process before any data had been collected, any publishable data had been collected. In practice, they're often brought along a little bit later, so they're not necessarily like, I don't want to say that this is that there's this Machiavellian perfect Machiavellian actor somewhere in the background who kind of understands everything. It's sort of an imperfect Machiavellian actor, sort of seizing opportunities as they come along. But yes, in a sense, the articles are designed to support a market position.
So, on this Machiavellian dimension, I just want to relate. For me, in my training years as a PhD student, I remember, I think it was in 2010, so there was the Selling Sickness conference in Amsterdam, and I caught this little discussion you were having. So it was not during a panel, it was like in the corridor, but this discussion you were having with Lehman McHenry. So law professor focusing on medical ethics in the United States. He's been central in suing different companies over publication plans, both in the medical sector, but also I think he's in charge of the Monsanto papers right now, so in agrochemicals. And for me, Lehman McHenry, for him, these were Machiavellian people that we needed to put behind bars, and that's it. It's just we sue them and we put them in jail, and that's the solution. And I remember you were there trying to explain in a much more Foucauldian kind of way. So building on Michel Foucault, the importance of the influence in place, the social structures, people. I mean, there's a lot of good people working in this, but it's just they end up in a machine, more or less, that force them in terms of pushing in one direction. And I always really enjoyed this discussion because I agreed with both of you in the sense that Lehman McHenry has been, well, maybe not putting people behind bars, but making sure
costing them a lot of money.
Exactly. So in terms of financial penalties, there's a lot of, there's a lot of bad apples there. But at the same time, yes, we need to understand this with a larger perspective in terms of what's going on. And understand the structures of the industry, because the publication plan, it's not one or two people basically building this publication plan and organizing. Okay, these are the message we want to send out there about promote the off-label use of the product, for example, or say that the condition is underdiagnosed and blah blah blah. There's a lot of people behind a publication plan. So how does that work, more or less?
Yeah, you're right. You're absolutely right. There's sometimes huge numbers of people. It depends on how big a drug is going to be, right? So if we're talking about a drug that is projected to be a blockbuster, then you're going to have dozens of people involved in creating a publication plan, signing off, editing it, signing off on it, etc. So that it's a major document that is, in a sense, providing a roadmap, and then in a confusing way that the same people who call themselves publication planners don't just create the document. They're not just doing the planning. but then they implement the plan too. They follow it. They follow it along, and they're involved in the creation of the articles, not necessarily the writing of the articles, but in the creation, the vetting, the editing, and so on and so forth. So there's publication planning is a bit of an amorphous. It's a title that covers a number of closely related things. But yeah, I was remembering Lehman and I had I think our major disagreement was over the question of whether it mattered whether or not the articles told the truth. Because from his point of view, and especially from his point of view as a litigator, as an advisor to litigation, the truth was actually the crucial thing, because the question, you can't sue people for telling the truth. You can only sue people if they're misleading. And whereas I was interested in questions about the shaping in a more general sense of the questions and the ideas and the lenses through which people look at things and so on and so forth. So so our big disagreement was actually about whether the sorts of things that I cared about mattered at all. And he basically said, well, look, if they tell the truth, then it's all the more power to them. Whereas I think we need to look at the texture of the truths that they tell. Which truths? There are too many.
And this is an important point, because in terms of this notion of truth, truth is not basically everything you can say without being sued for saying it, basically. Because one of the issue is also the cherry picking of the results. The thing is, okay, I'm doing clinical trials, I see all these great benefits that the drug might be having, and I will be promoting these benefits as much as possible. But then, oh wow, there's some serious adverse drug reactions that are possible with this specific product. And the thing is, what do I do with this? And I think part of the publication plan is to make sure that we control the narrative. Well, I think it's Robert Proctor, when discussing, the tobacco industry, developed the notion of agnotology, so the selective production of ignorance. So sometimes producing ignorance can be very profitable for the industry, but at the same time, ignorance is not lying; it's just basically a selective cherry picking of the truth.
Yeah, I think that there are two sides to this, and that the industry does both really well. One is to ignore the kinds of issues that the industry wants to ignore. So it will either not produce clinical trial, not do clinical trials that might show the kinds of things that it doesn't want to show, or change endpoints, perhaps change the primary endpoints in the course of a trial, which basically that means that if you start out the trial and you're purporting to measure one thing, and the measurements you don't like what you're seeing.
It's not juicy enough in terms of results.
That's right.
It cannot support the sales pitch of.
That's right. Then you might change the primary endpoint to something else in midstream, which is very frowned upon, but sometimes there are good reasons to do it. And of course, the industry wants to capitalize on anything that might be considered a good reason to do it. So that's one side, the creation of ignorance. So let's just not look over there behind that particular curtain, and we won't see the things that we don't want to see. The other thing is really doing a very, very good job of promoting the messages that it wants to promote. So it's a two-sided process. You de-emphasize one thing, don't bring it into the light at all, and then really emphasize some other things that the industry wants to emphasize, and sort of promote that as much as possible. So there was a great study. Now it's 2 decades old, but great study of publications of antidepressants that was done on the basis of looking at Scandinavian regulators back before the Europe had a more unified process. But anyway, so looking at Scandinavian regulators, the researchers were able to show that there were some clinical trials that had been multiply published, that and not necessarily in a way that's illegitimate, but they've been multiply published in part by just changing the question of the publication. So then you have, if you have 5 clinical trials to work from, you might sort of take one population that cuts across five clinical trials and recombine your data and republish that, instead of sort of treating each one as an individual event. So.
And at the same time, this is very important, because we need to understand we're doing clinical trials, but private clinical trials by drug companies produce private results. When you want to get your drug approved, you need to submit all the data that were produced. But right. In the medical literature, you don't need to do that. Basically, this is where the publication plan comes in, and you cherry pick which results you want to see published out there, in which way you want to see them published, versus selecting which one you don't want to see published out there. And this is important because the medical professionals or physicians who are the prescribers, the one who are deciding, we need to keep in mind, pharmaceutical market, in economics terms, this is a fantastic market. The demand side are physician prescribing products, but not paying for the product. Mm-hmm. So to put this in economic terms, this is a market where the demand side has no budget constraint, which is basically the El Dorado in any economics textbook. But the knowledge to which physicians and prescribers have access to are medical journals. And the medical journals, this is not all data. These are the cherry-picked data. How much of the medical literature is shaped by these publication plans?
That's really difficult to estimate, but I think we have a couple of point estimates for some very specific things. I think if you take a look at drugs that have been recently launched into the market, let's say within 5 years of the launch, and are selling are reasonably big sellers, and finally, I think follow that pattern that you just described, where in fact there are individual physician prescribers for these drugs, as opposed to hospital-based things or something like that. Or government-based things like public health measures. Then I think we can say that something like 40% of the articles in what are called core clinical journals, the ones that are more important, are influenced by publication plans. So there's a lot of hedges there. But I think if we look at, basically recent in-patent drugs looking to be sort of big sellers, then it's about 40% of. articles in major journals, not the tiny little things. The pharmaceutical companies don't generally play around with the tiny journals.
But medical journals, I mean, should be very concerned about this. It's just they should be up in arms, trying to make sure that this type of bias, not bias in the sense that it's not telling the truth, but bias in the sense that it's a
the thumb on the scale.
It's a one-sided version of the narrative about the product, and so at the same time, for me, that was my big aha moment, understanding that what is a drug company is not producing drugs. A drug company is first and foremost producing a narrative about the drug. And as soon as we have this in mind, it's just things becomes way more clear in terms of what is the core activity of a drug company. But why?
You know, when oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Go ahead, my friend.
I was gonna say that once I was at a pharmaceutical marketing conference, and the person sitting next to me and I had a wonderful conversation, and he said something that has really stuck in my head ever since, and which is that a drug is just a molecule surrounded by information. That and so that's that's exactly making your point there. That's it. It's the narrative. It's the narrative. It's the information that is first and foremost.
But medical journals, which are the scientific channels through which we inform physicians, they should be trying to make sure that that they are not impacted by these publication plans. And is it the case? Are medical journals fighting against that, or are embracing the phenomenon? What's happening with medical journals?
So, I mean, it's really interesting. So I was wondering about that when I first started doing this kind of research. I wondered about that too. But it seems that while there are individual editors who make a big deal about this kind of problem, the journals themselves are conflicted. And the reason that they're conflicted is the pharmaceutical industry runs biggish trials. They run the kinds of things that people have been telling doctors to pay attention to for a couple of generations now. For 50 years, people have been telling doctors, don't pay attention to case reports or anything like that. Those could be very biased. Pay attention to large randomized controlled trials. These are the kinds of things that the industry excels in producing. So in fact, the industry is producing exactly the kind of information, exactly the kind in the form in the journal, these manuscripts that get submitted to journals, that the journals want to see. They're also going to get promoted better after they're published. So,
and I just want to say, for being an independent researcher submitting papers to scientific journals, it's just I'm good in some stuff. I'm not good in everything. It's just I don't have a team of statisticians helping me out with the model. And when I'm submitting something to a scientific journal, sometimes in the peer review process, they will be asking for major revisions. Things are complicated. I think my paper would have been much better from the start if I had this whole team of technicians basically revising the whole thing, copy editing, making sure all the stats are fine, and sending this. And you have a super paper that is, in fact, of much greater quality of any paper you might have from an independent researcher.
I think that's exactly right. Individual researchers, whether medical researchers or any other kind of researchers, are not in a position to produce the kind of clean, neat manuscripts and then eventually journal articles that a pharmaceutical company can produce, right? That the company just has better resources than any individual medical researcher. So again, in terms of what the journals want to see, that's really perfect. That's ideal. And then, as I said, it gets promoted better afterwards too. So the journals can say, well, look, that not only did we publish this study, but it was reported on in these following newspapers, and that's valuable to them as well.
And the name of the game in scientific publication right now is the impact factor. So there's a huge difference in publishing an independent paper. There's a lot of stupid academics like me who think that, okay, I did my job in terms of research, I'm publishing the research, job is done, now I'm doing research on something else. But the thing is, this is only part of what needs to be done in order to get the message out there. If I can send an army of sales rep putting a copy of the study on every physician's office in the country, that's a huge difference. And this is where I can inflate the impact factor that the study will have. Mm-hmm. So at the same time, not only greater quality papers from the start in terms of the peer review process, but at the same time, something way more promoted, but that will increase the impact factor accordingly for the scientific journal. Any money issues involved as well?
Sometimes there are. One of the money issues is reprints of articles, which used to be physical reprints and now are electronic reprints. But so a pharmaceutical company, used to want to take a physical copy of the article and land it on a doctor's desk and a prescriber's desk, and so that meant that they had to buy those physical copies from the journals. Now they buy electronic copies and distribute them to doctors sort of independently. But that's so that's a money issue, and sometimes it matters a lot. So there is a story, which I believe to be true, that there was one article that was published in the New England Journal of Medicine that the company that had sponsored the article and pushed it through bought 800,000 copies of it, which was enough for one for every physician's desk in North America and large chunks of Europe. So the 800,000 copies cost more than $1 million. That cost that company more than $1 million. So that's an extreme case. But learning about that extreme case, there was actually I got curious, and so I decided to, with a little bit of subterfuge, I apologize, but I wrote to the New England Journal of Medicine, wrote an email to them and said, if I wanted to buy, I think I said 10,000 copies of an 8-page article in black and white, what would be the price? What would be the cost of that? And they got back to me within hours with a price, which means basically they have a set rate of it. And I forget exactly, it was $14,000 or something like that. So $1.40 US per copy of the article, which is roughly in line with what would have been the case for a very large print run. So,
but at the same, it just things have changed a little bit since the year 2000s. So with clinicaltrials.gov, so now every time you're doing clinical trials, you need to register this and basically tell what is the old protocol, the endpoints you're looking at, etc. We have also way more transparency. So, for example, Health Canada, of all places in the world, Health Canada has been taking the lead in terms of clinical trial data transparency. Now, for every new drug that is arriving on the market in Canada, all the clinical data are published on this web portal, publicly available, almost no redaction. So for example, with COVID-19, all the issues with the vaccines, and some people saying, well, it's on secret. There was one place in the world where you could get all the data about these vaccines. It was on the web portal of Health Canada, which was a bit amazing. So are we seeing a drastic change in terms of these practices, or there's still always ways to circumvent the new foundations of transparency where some people are trying to put around these issues?
Sure. I think that there are always ways to circumvent. I mean, I think that there's a bit of a game sort of being played. It's a sort of an escalation game. The companies figure out ways to circumvent transparency. I mean, one of the things is that data that gets published in these repositories is like the data that's published as a result of Health Canada's mandates. That's really difficult to negotiate. It's very difficult to actually work with that data to produce results. Whereas the nice thing about a journal article is that it is a packaged result. Somebody has decided exactly what the shape of the thing is and has put it out there. So that's a kind of so there's just a user friendliness to scientific journal articles that there isn't to the repositories. So maybe transparency, I mean, I think transparency is wonderful. I'm all in favor of transparency, but it doesn't necessarily solve all the problems. We need to have researchers who are equipped to really work with all of that data and not just create controversies, but actually sort of establish what the results show with some sort of authority.
And for me, what's important here is one of the problems with private clinical trials is just if I'm a drug company, I'm doing a clinical trial over a specific product, just the whole design of the research is only about showing how my own product is better than everybody else. But the other company that will have a similar product in the same therapeutic category will do the exact same thing and design the research in ways to show their product is better than others. And the design, the research questions is always about basically how to promote our own product. But for the prescribing physician, the only thing I want to know is, okay, with my patient in front of me, what is the best treatment, the optimal treatment I can provide to that patient? But the thing is, from private clinical trials, this is not the type of research question that is being asked in terms of what is the best potential product for this specific condition. This is the type of question that public clinical trials, for example, with the NIH in the United States, this is the type of question they will be asking. So I'm not saying that we need to eliminate all private clinical trials. What I'm saying is that there's a need, a very important research niche that can be filled by public clinical trials in order to provide the research questions necessary for physicians. Sergio, before you go and everything, what can we do to improve existing practices? I mean, for me, the big issue here is, since I've been working on this, there's one person in the world that make me very skeptical of science and force me to develop some very healthy skepticism. But how can we rebuild trust in science? What can be done to improve things?
Well, I think, there are some avenues we can start taking. I mean, first of all, I want to think that the transparency measures are really important. And then we can see how they work sometimes when journalists work with medical researchers to take a look at some of the data, and then they end up telling different stories. And you might find adverse events that weren't being reported before, or something like that. So that's one kind of thing. So that's something that's being done, and I think that is a step in the right direction. You talked about what can the journals do? And although it is not currently in their interest to cut off articles that are ultimately from pharmaceutical companies, that are sponsored by pharmaceutical companies.
And maybe a bit of a shout out to journals like, I think, PLOS Medicine or the British Medical Journal, who has been a bit more proactive in trying to reduce these practices.
Right. And editors who've spoken out quite a bit. Although I do think that the editors-in-chief tend to be more radical than the journals. That they tend to be more proactive and radical than the journals that they represent. So it's one thing for an editor-in-chief to talk about this kind of thing in public, and then it's quite another thing for the journal. And these are large commercial enterprises. The big journals like the British Medical Journal or something like that. Mm-hmm. These are very, very large, and they move much more slowly. Well, I had an idea for how to change the behavior of some of the journals, and it was this: what if you mentioned the British Medical Journal? There are a handful of journals that everybody knows the names of. Journals like the Journal of the American Medical Association, or JAMA, British Medical Journal, or BMJ, New England Journal of Medicine, et cetera, et cetera. It's a handful of really high-profile journals. What if we got all the editors of those journals into a room, and we said, okay, we're just going to talk to 15 or 20 people or something like that in a room, and got them to commit to not accepting articles that were commercially funded, period. And so then they would have some maybe gold star on the webpage of the journal that says industry free or something like that, organic, right? sort of it's like the equivalent of some sort of certified organic or fair trade or something like that, but the certified industry free. And so we wouldn't aim to talk to all journals, because that would be too challenging a problem. But if we could get a small number to commit to being certified and industry free, then maybe that would actually help their brands to some extent, and also mean that they could be the loci, the places to which other people could send things that would be sort of not necessarily critical of privately funded trials, but it could do independent analysis of private trials, or systematic reviews that could talk about the private trials, a little bit like what the Cochrane collaboration was set up to do.
Okay.
So I think that there's some potential here.
But what do you say to somebody who will tell you, well, even commercial trials, in the end, what is being published is true information. So and oh geez,
So yeah, I think it doesn't matter. I think some things that are not certified organic are really good for you, but that's you might still want to grab just to go with the brand, right? That little bit of information might tell you something. Like if you're somebody who likes organic food, right? Then you might say that this is a value to you. It doesn't matter if there are other things that would also be healthy to eat.
yeah. And for me, this is something a bit amazing. We've been talking about randomized control trials, so RCTs. The idea of randomized control trials is this idea that, if it's just an observational study looking at the way people are reacting to drugs without a control group, basically it can create some bias. And then we saw, okay, well, there's some issues when the physicians know who get the drugs versus who gets the placebo, then that can create bias as well. So the patient should not know if he's getting the drug or the placebo, and the doctor should not be knowing who gets what in order to make sure that it doesn't create bias. But the thing is, when it's a freaking commercial clinical trial, there's systematically, there's one Cochrane review that explained that. It was the one you wrote on this. So systematically, we see that there is a bias with the commercial funding of a trial. But still, when it comes to medical journals, yes, we want randomized, controlled, double-blind trials. But if it's commercially funded or not, well, we don't care about that because it doesn't impact the truthness
Right.
But yes, it does. Absolutely, it does.
Yeah, I think it's been well established that it's the mere fact of commercial sponsorship, independent private sponsorship of a trial affects the probability of results that will be favorable to the sponsor, right? If the company funds the trial, the chances are higher that the results are going to favor the company. So we know that, but the journals they're not interested in that kind of information because they treat the methodology as neutral. They don't see themselves as in the business of policing that kind of thing. That's something that could change. Let me mention one other thing that you asked us, or how we could change. And I'm just talking about this practice, let alone all the other practices by which pharmaceutical companies influence what doctors know and how they know it and that sort of thing. But just in terms of this one thing, in terms of the publication planning, it's a minor thing, but governments should not treat what pharmaceutical companies do as research. They should not fund, they should tax pharmaceutical companies as if there were no research costs, because all the research is effectively marketing. So we could any kinds of preferential tax structures to support research should be thrown out, because the research is not actually research, or it's not independent of marketing. I shouldn't say that it's not actually research. It is genuine research. It's just that it's not independent of marketing.
My friend, you're making me so happy. I went to bed like at 3:00 in the morning this morning. It's just I was writing this paper about the calculation of R&D investment in the Canadian pharmaceutical sector, and basically showing exactly these issues. In one example, I was using phase 4 clinical trials. You can have these large observational studies once the drug hit the market, but most of this is considered to be what we call seeding trials. So basically, just a way to bring in physicians to switch their patients to this new, more expensive products. And you will pay physicians like $300 for each patient they switch on this new product. So the cost of the clinical trial, basically, it's for the money you're giving doctors to switch their patients. But for me, this is institutionalized bribes. But according to the tax credit system we have in Canada, SRNED, so phase 4 clinical trials are part of other qualifying research and development costs that can benefit these tax credits, and basically we're providing tax credits for institutionalized bribes. Well, that could be one interpretation of this. So, well, thank you for saying this, because just I spent the whole night writing my paper on this. But in terms of policing and everything, Blue, are we doing okay? Is there anything we said that was problematic? That
No, everything was very clear.
Finally, what do I wish you before you go? What is the best thing I can wish you when it comes to these issues?
It's a very hard question. What is the best thing that you can wish me? I wish that this podcast has some real, get some real reach out there, because I think that these are very interesting issues that you're exploring today, but also I think that you're going to explore with future guests, because as you take this sort of from its starting points and you explore some of the questions of how companies in different sectors try to shape the informational context in which they work, then I think that's really important for people to understand. I think that it's crucial, and the pharmaceutical industry is only the most prominent, biggest example of something where the narrative counts much more than anything else. So,
well, thank you so much, Sergio, and thank you for basically sending back these wishes for the podcast. And I really hope that this podcast would allow this type of discussions with different people from the different perspectives as well, looking at the different dimensions of corporate power and how it plays in the way of shaping social structures. Not only the science, we focus on science, but looking as well at what happened in the markets in terms of mergers and acquisitions, media communications, regulatory capture. These are the issues I wish we will be able to explore in the coming podcast. Sergio, thank you so much.
Marc-André, thank you very much. Farewell.
Take good care.
You too.
Thank you for listening. Please follow us online by registering for our website's newsletter at carleton.ca/ghost management. You can also follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @GM Research Group. Our musical theme is Hablando por Hablar by Alex Cuba. The Ghost Management Research Project is funded through an Insight grant from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada and its initiative for digital citizen research. The funders had no role in the design, conduct, or publication of the content. Thank you for your interest, and we'll see you soon.